Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Clyde Barrow, the outlaw who blazed across America's backroads with Bonnie by his side. To some, he was a ruthless criminal. To others, a rebellious legend who defied the law at every turn. Quick with a gun, sharper with his mind, Clyde lived fast, hunted by police, yet driven by a hunger for freedom and notoriety. As you close your eyes, imagine the rumble of a stolen Ford V8 under the Texas moon, the echo of gunfire fading into the night, and the fleeting empire of a man who refused to bow to authority. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And also, like this video. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. Now settle in, and let the restless spirit of Clyde Barrow carry you into the night. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on the 24th of March 1909, near Tellico in Ellis County, Texas. His parents, Henry and Cumie, came from farm country and raised a large family that learned early to stretch every dollar and make do with little. Drought and debt pushed them toward Dallas when Clyde was a boy. They reached West Dallas with almost nothing, slept under a wagon until lumber scraps allowed a rough shack near the Trinity River. That settlement, a patchwork of hope and hardship, shaped him. He grew up thin, quick, and observant, a boy who loved music enough to carry a saxophone wherever he could, practicing on porches, dreaming of a stage even when his clothes carried the red dust of the road. He was bright, polite at times, funny when he wanted to be, but he hated feeling small under the thumb of want. Work came and went. Picking crops, stacking boxes, washing dishes, hauling whatever someone would pay to move. The neighborhood offered two educations, church songs, and family duty on one side, the tricky appeal of easy money on the other. He drifted toward the wrong group. By his mid-teens, he was skipping school, roaming with older boys who knew where keys hung by the back door and which lots sat dark at night. He loved cars, the way a good engine gave an instant escape. That love turned into trouble. His first arrest came in late 1926, after he borrowed a car from a dealer and failed to bring it back on time. It was a foolish stunt that taught him exactly the wrong lesson. He tasted jail, hated it, and decided he would get better at avoiding it rather than staying clear of crime. More missteps followed. He was picked up for auto theft again, and once for a petty theft case that involved stolen turkeys with his older brother, Marvin Buck Barrow. Though that matter didn't stick. Police learned his face, his habit of using false names, his knack for slipping away. He linked up with young thieves like Ralph Foltz and later Raymond Hamilton, breaking into stores after midnight, snatching cash from safes, and running stolen cars across county lines. Nothing about it was glamorous. It was messy, tense, and aimed at small targets that could barely afford the loss. In January 1930, everything changed for another reason. At a friend's house in West Dallas, Clyde met Bonnie Parker. She was a waitress, small and quick with a grin, married to a man named Roy Thornton but separated. She had a poet streak and a camera she loved. They were drawn to each other at once. He made her laugh. She steadied him. Their bond formed fast, without much space for caution, in rooms where coffee boiled on a stove and the radio crooned. They spent days walking, talking about music and better days. The trouble, though, was already closing in. Police had been building cases on Clyde's burglaries and car thefts. He was arrested that same year, facing several charges that added up to a long sentence. Bonnie visited him in county jail, then watched as he was shipped off to the Texas prison system. Clyde entered Eastham Prison Farm, a slim young man, and learned quickly how brutal that world could be. The farm worked men from dawn to dusk under guard. He carried cotton sacks, swung tools, and saw how the place pressed hope thin. Inside, he was targeted by hardened inmates and guards who believed pain kept order. He was abused. Cornered and desperate, he struck back at one tormentor. The man died from the beating. A lifer later claimed responsibility to shield Clyde, but the act left a mark on him that never faded. He also injured his own foot, severely cutting off 2 toes to escape the most punishing field labor. The move was rash, painful, and needless in hindsight, because a parole petition from his mother soon brought his release in early 1932. He left prison with a limp, a saxophone waiting at home, and a vow on his lips: never go back. Coming home didn't mean an easy restart. Texas in 1932 sat in the thick of the Great Depression. Bread lines stretched, jobs vanished, and former inmates faced closed doors. Clyde tried to find steady work, including a stint at a glass company, but his record shadowed him. Employers let him go as soon as a deputy wandered by to ask questions. He had grown hard during those years behind bars. Anger lived just beneath the surface, along with a stubborn belief that fast money was the only path that stayed open. He reconnected with old partners. He stole cars again, favoring strong engines that could outrun a county cruiser. He robbed filling stations and small shops, the kinds of places that kept lights on with coin jars and ledger books. He wasn't taking big hauls. He was scraping by and leaving fear behind him, hurting clerks and owners who had done nothing to deserve it. None of it looked like adventure to the people on the other side of the counter. Bonnie stuck beside him. In April 1932, she got caught in a failed attempt at a Kaufman County hardware store and landed in jail for weeks, writing verses and letters while she waited. Clyde kept moving. On April 30, during a robbery in Hillsborough, Texas, shop owner J.N. Boucher was shot and killed as the thieves fled. Accounts differ on who pulled the trigger, but the result was clear. A man with a family lost his life, and the law began to treat Clyde's circle not just as thieves but as dangerous felons. The pressure rose. Bonnie was released in June after a grand jury declined to indict her in that case, and she rejoined Clyde on the road. They drifted through Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas in borrowed cars, sleeping in tourist cabins or under the stars, living out of suitcases and paper sacks. Summer brought more trouble. On the 5th of August 1932, near Stringtown, Oklahoma, Clyde and companions were at a country dance when local officers approached. Tension spiked, shots were fired, and Deputy Eugene Moore was killed. Sheriff C.G. Maxwell suffered wounds. That night changed everything yet again. Killing a peace officer meant every trooper and county sheriff in the region put fresh urgency into the hunt. From then on, any traffic stop or roadside check carried the risk of violence. Towns put up wanted posters. Newspapers printed grainy photos. The group tried to stay one step ahead, moving fast and keeping to back roads. Motels took cash. Plates were swapped. In each county they left a trail of stolen fuel, frightened clerks, and families who slept poorly after hearing engines fade into the dark. They made mistakes too. Clyde sometimes returned to Dallas to see family, a dangerous habit. He favored familiar diners. He took reckless chances to keep a promise to never return to a cell. In late December, while trying to commandeer a car in Temple, Texas, they crossed paths with Under Sheriff Doyle Johnson. He confronted them outside his home. Another fast burst of gunfire, another loss. Johnson was shot and died soon after. The holidays turned somber for his household while the fugitives fled, trying to vanish again into winter roads and rented rooms. That crime hardened public opinion, even in places where bank failures and farm foreclosures had made some sympathize with outlaws. Sympathy withered when people saw deputies not return home. Between those headline moments lay a string of lesser robberies that wore communities down. Small banks briefly hit, filling stations emptied of their register cash, a grocery safe pried open after hours. Those choices created steady harm. Clerks lost wages. Owners lost savings. Customers found doors locked with handwritten signs saying, "Closed," and knew why. Each theft left detectives with new leads. A license plate seen by a farmer, a tire track in sand, a witness noticing Bonnie's slight frame or Clyde's limp. The pattern built a case that crossed state lines, pulling in highway patrol units and federal agents who tracked stolen cars. What began as a Dallas problem had become a regional manhunt. Still, the private rhythm of their days held ordinary moments. Bonnie clipped her hair short and wrote in notebooks. Clyde cleaned pistols and tuned the engine of whatever car they had last taken. They listened to dance tunes on the radio and ate ham sandwiches at roadside stands. Those quiet bits never erased the damage. People they robbed remembered faces as clearly as headlights in fog. Children and the families of those lost to gunfire grew up without a parent. A legend might skim over those facts. Real life does not. Clyde's early years show a path shaped by poverty and pride, but ultimately carved out by his own decisions. He learned the wrong skills, trusted the wrong partners, and stayed loyal to a code that hurt bystanders and brought grief to many homes. Law officers marked his file with deaths tied to his flight from capture. Courts in several states held warrants with his name. By the close of 1932, Clyde Barrow stood far from the boy with a saxophone on a West Dallas porch. He was a wanted man. The roads ahead would only grow more crowded with searchlights and badges, and every mile he put beneath his wheels would raise the stakes. For him, for Bonnie, for their families, and for the towns that woke to headlines they wished they would never have to read. The new year opened with colder mornings and roads that looked the same in every direction. A lanky teenager from West Dallas, W.D. Jones, drifted into Clyde's orbit during the holidays and stayed. He had turned 16, still carried the softness of a schoolboy, and wanted to feel older than the world allowed. Clyde put him behind a steering wheel, showed him how to swap plates, and trusted him to keep quiet. That choice pulled the boy into a life he couldn't control. They slept in tourist cabins with shades drawn, took meals at counter stools, and kept one ear on the door any time a bell chimed. Every stop held a risk. On the 6th of January 1933, the strain snapped again in West Dallas. Officers had set a quiet watch at a friend's house, believing the fugitives would swing by. When a car rolled up and doors opened, a quick burst of shots broke the hush. Deputy Malcolm Davis was hit and did not make it home. That loss deepened the chase. The badge meant something personal to men across the region, and the death of a deputy lit a signal flare. Patrols tightened. Lists of license numbers passed across desks. The names Barrow and Parker carried more weight in squad rooms than ever before. Clyde tried to keep moving. He hit small banks, roadside stores, and gas stations that could not spare what they lost. A postmaster found a jar of money gone. A grocer unlocked his shop to find a pre-opened safe and coins on the floor. Attendants at filling stations had long shifts already. Now they had to memorize faces and watch the dusk for headlights that might bring trouble. Many robberies took seconds. A counter, a drawer, a rush to the door. None of it was heroic. It was taking from people who counted bills at the end of the night and prayed they could still pay rent. Spring brought family back into the picture. Clyde's older brother, Marvin Buck Barrow, had been paroled in March 1933. He came out with his wife, Blanche, hoping to steer his younger brother toward surrender. That intention met the undertow of habit. The four rented a small garage apartment in Joplin, Missouri, stacked with suitcases and guns. They laughed, cooked, and argued in tight quarters, trying to pretend they were just another set of renters. Neighbors noticed the late hours, the smell of spilled liquor, the constant comings and goings. Reports reached the police that a group of suspicious strangers was holed up in town. On April 13, local officers moved to question the tenants. They didn't expect a barricade. The door opened into a storm of gunfire that lasted moments but changed many lives. Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman did not survive. The group fled, leaving behind a tangle of belongings. Weapons, a typewriter, Bonnie's notebooks, and a camera with exposed rolls of film. When the pictures were developed, newspapers splashed the images across front pages. Bonnie standing with a pistol propped on her hip, a cigar pinched between her fingers in one frame, Clyde in a hat grinning hard. A spur-of-the-moment pose that turned into a national symbol. The photographs were theater. The reality on the road stayed harsh. Cramped sleep, quick meals, wounds that lingered, and the knowledge that two lawmen had gone down in a modest Missouri town while doing their jobs. They drove south and east, then back north again, mapping a restless circle across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and beyond. On April 27 near Ruston, Louisiana, another episode added to their trail. They commandeered a car with two travelers, H.D. Darby, an undertaker, and his friend, Sophia Stone. The captives later said the pair treated them surprisingly politely, even offering a few dollars before letting them go. That day stoked the strange legend that grew around the fugitives. Unpredictable, sometimes oddly courteous, yet always armed and dangerous. Years later, in a twist that folklore never forgot, Darby would be called to prepare the bodies of the same two people who had once forced him to ride along a back road. The irony rang loud, but it didn't undo the fear those encounters planted in strangers. In June, their luck changed in a different way. Driving near Wellington, Texas, they missed a warning about a bridge under repair and went off the edge into a creek bed. The wreck was bad. Bonnie suffered severe burns to her leg and could barely walk. Pain trailed her from that day forward, making travel slower, rest scarce, and every sudden move harder. The gang forced help at gunpoint, taking a car from locals, disarming the town marshal, and pushing on with blankets and makeshift bandages. They let those they seized go without further harm, but the damage, both physical and legal, had deepened. Stories about the crash and the kidnapping of officials sped across state lines. The chase now included roadside checks in little towns where people seldom saw newspaper headlines. The days after the wreck were a blur of motel rooms, borrowed crutches, and trusted back roads. Clyde nursed the engine each morning, then Bonnie through long afternoons. Buck and Blanche tried to keep spirits steady, though stress etched lines into every face. W.D. Jones, spooked by how close disaster had come, looked for escape. He was still in, though, at least for a while. By mid-July, they limped into the Red Crown Tourist Court near Platte City, Missouri, a tidy set of brick cabins with shared garages. Their caution slipped. They ordered meals by phone, asked for extra supplies, and paid in cash. The manager had noticed police bulletins and the way a certain brand of tire sat heavy on a fender. He called Sheriff Holt Coffee. Before dawn on July 20, officers assembled outside, bringing an improvised armored car and spotlights. When the lights snapped on, the garage doors glowed, and shouts cut through the dark. Bullets followed. The group blasted their way out, glass and dust flying. Sheriff Coffee and another officer were hit but survived. Blanche's right eye was injured by shattering glass. Buck was struck in the skull and left staggering blood on his shirt, his thoughts slipping in and out. They still managed to drive away, a miracle of raw will and horsepower. But that escape bought only hours. News of the battle spread, phone lines crackled, and the net drew tighter. They found a wooded spot at an abandoned fairground Dexfield Park near Dexter, Iowa, hoping to let Buck rest and to plan a next step. Farmers noticed smoke from a campfire and unusual tracks, then recognized faces from the papers. Deputies and local men formed a posse and crept through the trees at dawn on July 24. Another fight broke out among the old rides and weeds. Clyde and Bonnie, barely upright, pulled Buck toward a car, Blanche covering them as best she could, but the odds were lopsided. W.D. ran for his life into the brush and slipped away. Blanche was captured, shaken, her dress torn by movement and the summer heat, her injured eye clouded. Buck, gravely hurt, was taken into custody. He died in a hospital in Perry, Iowa, days later. Blanche later faced trial and served time, then told her story, adding a human curve to a saga that too often gets flattened into headlines. After Dexfield, the famous pair were down to a couple again, one limping, the other nursing a lifetime of grudges against the system that had ground him down and the choices that were steadily shrinking his future. They patched Bonnie's leg with salves, wrapped it in strips of cloth, and drove slowly. Some nights they slept in the car. Other nights, they found a cabin and paid cash, no questions. The road ran quiet through cornfields and pastureland, then roared near towns when trains thundered past. Warm air moved through open windows with the smell of creosote and cut hay. They held each other's hands and waited for sleep that didn't come easy. Meanwhile, pieces of the group's history began to surface through arrests and interviews. In November 1933, after months on his own, W.D. Jones was caught in Houston. He talked to authorities. He was a teenager trying to explain how he'd been pulled into events too big for him. His account gave investigators a clearer picture of nights that had looked confused and foggy from the outside. Reporters wrote stories that moved between facts and sensation. The effect was to anchor some details, dates, names, the order of stops, while fanning the notoriety that made motels and diners raise their guard anytime a couple with Texas accents walked in. Late in the year, the pair returned to their old pattern of quick visits with family under the eye of watchful deputies. In Dallas County, Sheriff Smoot Schmidt and his men tried an ambush near Sowers on November 22. Having learned the fugitives might slip into the area to see loved ones around the holidays. Lawmen waited in ditches and behind trees as a car crept down the road. The trap sprang, shots snapped the stillness, tires squealed, and once more the fugitives roared off into the dark, the air behind them filled with dust and smoke. A deputy took a wound, and the disappointment in the sheriff's office ran deep. For families on both sides, relatives of the pursued and relatives of the pursuers, The holiday season felt brittle and uncertain. Even when they were not stealing, the pair were breaking laws just by crossing lines in stolen cars. They took gas without paying, swapped tags, and quietly lifted license plates. They robbed banks when opportunities seemed favorable, though in truth, they preferred targets where watchmen were few and alarms slow. Police files linked the pair to robberies in small towns where customers might know a teller by first name. Those crimes didn't earn much compared to the headlines they generated. Every dollar carried the cost of sleep lost by clerks and families who kept their doors locked and their windows shaded for months after. That human toll often gets lost in the retelling. It shouldn't. Bonnie wrote to pass time, and to find a way to say what the running felt like. She scribbled verses on scraps of paper, sometimes funny, sometimes full of sorrow. The poems never turned wrong into right. They showed an effort to make sense of a path that had left too much pain behind it. Clyde, for his part, kept engines tuned and hands busy. He practiced quick reloads, checked maps, and watched the mirror with a fixed focus that left his jaw tight. He trusted almost no one, not even his own luck, which had curved toward disaster again and again. Investigators in Texas were thinking ahead. They had seen how often Clyde returned to talk with family and how the prison years defined his anger. Agents in Austin and Dallas suspected he might try to strike at the root of that anger by helping others break out of the fields where he had swung a hoe until his hands burned. Officers gathered information about which inmates were his friends and which farm units felt most vulnerable. Rumors floated through cell blocks about an outside car with a strong motor and a driver who could make a gate look like a suggestion rather than a boundary. Guards checked their watchtowers a little more often. Wardens argued for better staffing and sturdy fences. By the final weeks of 1933, the picture of Clyde Barrow had sharpened in the public mind. He was not the cheerfully reckless boy from a staged photograph. He was a man who had taken lives and lives away, who stole to stay free and kept moving because stopping meant the past would catch up. He and Bonnie had lost a brother and a safe path. Blanche was behind bars. W.D. had been picked up and was now a witness for the state. The small comforts left were music from a radio, when a signal came in clear, the taste of hot coffee after a cold drive, and rare quiet hours when nobody knocked on a door. Every county line brought a new set of badges, and every new set of badges brought the chance that somebody would misjudge a shadow and make a final mistake. The winter wind moved across the plains with a low hum, carrying dust and the smell of smoke from farmhouses. In that air, a plan took shape that would push the story into an even harsher chapter. It pointed back to the tall fences and flat fields of a prison farm, where Clyde had felt small and powerless. He believed that if he could break the lock for men he knew names he murmured at night, he could claim one more season of freedom. The road to that attempt ran past family porches in West Dallas and down through pine breaks toward the Trinity Bottomlands, then further east into country where telephone lines sagged between poles in the sky at dawn looked like a wide sheet of pale steel. The map looked straightforward. The cost would not be. Dawn came on a gray January morning with cold mist hanging over flat fields and bare trees. A work gang filed out from Eastham Prison Farm, guarded by men with rifles who had walked those rows so long they knew each fence post by feel. A car idled beyond a bend, motor low, its driver tight with resolve. Clyde had been thinking about this place since the day he left it. He believed he owed something to men he had known inside Raymond Hamilton, Joe Palmer, Henry Methvin, faces he could picture as clearly as mile markers. He also believed that if he struck here, he could wound the system he hated. When the moment came, it lasted only minutes, and changed a lot more than his own fate. Shots cracked through the morning. Prisoners ran. A guard, Major Joe Crowson, was hit, and later died. Sirens sounded. The field seemed to hold their breath. It was not a movie scene. It was a tear in the lives of everyone there, from families waiting at home to officers who had kept order for years without ever seeing a day like that. The escape worked. Hamilton, Palmer, Methvin, and others scattered with the help of that waiting car. Bonnie sat rigid beside Clyde as they sped away, her legs still tender from the wreck in Texas the summer before. They swapped vehicles, ducked down side roads, and kept one eye on the mirror. Newspapers flew off presses before lunch. Editors in Dallas, Houston, and beyond ran headlines that linked the raid to a pair already infamous for earlier killings. The story crossed state lines faster than they could drive. Inside the Texas Prison Administration, the reaction was swift. Officials remembered Clyde's vows about never going back and saw the break as proof he meant them. The man in charge of the state's prison system, Lee Simmons, promised that the fugitives would be hunted with patience and skill. He called on a former Texas Ranger, known for quiet persistence and keen eyes, Frank Hamer. Hamer was tall, deliberate, and stubborn. He had spent years on back roads dealing with rustlers, ambushers, and feuds that grew out of dry land and bad luck. In February 1934, he took the assignment and set to work without fanfare. He read reports, drove the highways, and learned the rhythm of his quarry. He saw how Clyde favored certain counties and how often he circled back to family. He noticed that Bonnie's injury had slowed their pace. He tracked friends and cousins through little towns where everyone knew who had put up a new chicken coop or bought a new tire. He partnered with another seasoned hand, Manny Galt, and reached out to sheriffs in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana who could add local knowledge to the chase. Meanwhile, the newly expanded group tried to keep going. The men freed from Eastham were restless and not always loyal in the same way or to the same ends. Hamilton had his own ideas about targets. Palmer was volatile and carried the weight of the guard's death. Methvin was young and from a family across the line in Louisiana. Bonnie and Clyde carried on as they always had quick stops, cash only, and engines running, but their circle felt less steady with every mile. They robbed small banks when they spotted light security and easy exits. They hit groceries, filling stations, and stores where the night clerk stood alone under a single bulb. They took getaway cars at gunpoint, ordered drivers to step away, then left them behind on the edge of town with shaken hands and a story to tell. In several abductions, they gave captives a little cash and told them not to rush to a phone, a strange mix of menace and awkward courtesy that still left people scared long after. Police files in early 1934 filled with sightings, partial plates, and names of towns where a pair with Texas accents had taken cash and disappeared. Some robberies lasted minutes. In a few, the loot didn't cover more than a week's expenses. A myth grew that banks were the only targets, but reality showed a lot of working people on the wrong end of the barrel. Cashiers, car owners, grocers. Every time the group slipped out of a county, officers there wrote up what they knew and mailed it on. The result was a map of traces, thin lines connecting gas stations, dirt roads, and roadside diners with neon clocks glowing in their windows. By late March, tension inside the small circle peaked, Hamilton and Clyde argued. Some said it was about how to divide money. Others said it was about the risk level of certain jobs. The quarrels carried sharp edges because everyone knew the next mistake might be final. Hamilton drifted off again for a time, then back, then away once more. A pattern that showed how friendship and fear can tangle when pressure never lets up. Hamer watched all of it from a distance and filed it away. On April 1, a Sunday afternoon near Grapevine, Texas, two highway patrolmen, E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy, stopped their motorcycles on a stretch of country road. They had their own rhythms, writing warnings, checking registrations, waving hello to families driving to and from gatherings. A car rolled up. What happened in the next moments has been told and retold with fierce debate, but the outcome is not in dispute. The officers were shot and died there on the roadside. Accounts during those first days were chaotic. Some claimed Bonnie had laughed or fired. Those reports were later walked back by the very people who repeated them, but the memory of the rumor stuck and did long damage to her name. The loss of two young officers on a quiet day hit Texans hard. It sparked anger that cut across the mixed feelings some had harbored in earlier months. Funds were raised for rewards. Phone calls flew between counties. Patrol cars rolled with an edge that hadn't been there before. 5 days later, near Commerce, Oklahoma, another encounter spun out of control. Local officers approached a car, not knowing exactly who sat inside. Shots rang out. Constable Cal Campbell was killed. Police Chief Percy Boyd was seized and forced into a ride that crossed into Kansas. During hours in the car, Boyd saw the fugitives up close, not as faces in a newspaper, but as tired people on the edge. Bonnie, in pain from her old injuries, handed him a blanket against the chill. They finally let him go near Fort Scott. He lived to testify, to point to the people who had taken him, and to add details that helped investigators shape their picture of the pair. Those 2 April incidents, the highway patrolman near Grapevine, the constable near Commerce, cemented the sense that talk of romance had to yield to reality. Families carved dates into headstones. Departments pinned black crepe to badges. The public mood flipped. Earlier, during the worst of the Depression, some readers had told themselves the pair were striking at institutions that had failed them. That loose sympathy evaporated when the victims wore uniforms, or when store owners and clerks told how close they had come to never seeing their families again. Editorials thundered. Ministers preached about the cost of choices that trade grace for speed. Parents kept their kids inside on evenings when they would usually chase fireflies. The idea of folk heroes sounded hollow. Hamer, watching this turn, pushed harder. He studied the group's car choices and knew they liked horsepower and newer models. He guessed routes based on where they could find fuel and where the roads turned from gravel to pavement. He flagged the bond that had grown between Henry Methvin and the pair after the Easton break and made note of where Methvin's family lived in Louisiana. He wore plain clothes, drove long stretches, and kept his own counsel. He built an alliance from men who knew different parts of the map. Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton from Dallas County, who knew the family ties in West Dallas. Prentice Oakley from Bienville Parish, Sheriff Henderson, Jordan of the same parish, and his own partner, Manny Galt. He talked through signals, firing arcs, and where to take a position on a 2-lane road edged by tall pines. He waited. Patience is not glamorous. It's a lot of miles and a lot of quiet. On the run, Bonnie and Clyde tried to nurse what was left of their strength. She soaked her leg when they could, wrapped it tight, and leaned on him when walking grew hard. He tuned engines in motel garages, wiped prints, and kept maps wrinkled from use. They took some risks they had avoided before, like re-entering counties where deputies knew their families by first name. They still robbed here and there, part habit, part need, part stubborn proof to themselves that they could. Smaller banks in Oklahoma and Texas filed reports that named the same pair. A few robberies failed when locals hit alarms, or when the fugitives saw patrol cars and reeled away before they crossed a threshold. Those days left nerves frayed and tempers short. After the Commerce kidnapping, law enforcement from several states coordinated better. They shared radio calls, compared notes on license numbers, and retold the details that Percy Boyd had given them. The sound of voices, the way Bonnie favored a leg, the way Clyde's hands were steady even when his voice ran fast. The picture sharpened. At the same time, Methvin's family life became an unexpected thread. His parents lived near the line in Louisiana. They could not ignore their son, but contact with him carried risk. Talk spread in that community about a powerful car with Texas plates and the young man riding in it. In April and early May, the circle around Clyde and Bonnie loosened and tightened by turns. Hamilton faded out of view. He would be picked up later and face trial for his part in the violent escape and other crimes. Palmer was arrested and eventually convicted for the guard's death. The fates of those men would wind through courts and cells to an end in the state's last room. Their choices had set that path. For Bonnie and Clyde, each day now felt like a race with a clock they could not read. They drove across East Texas pine country and into northern Louisiana, then back into Arkansas and Oklahoma, always a little hungry, a little tired, always alert. They kept seeing family in quick, risky visits. Bonnie's mother, Emma, had pleaded publicly for a surrender that would spare lives. Clyde's mother, Cumie, never stopped feeding anyone who came to her door, a habit that gave warmth in hard years, but also drew the eye of men with badges who kept notes on comings and goings. Those porch visits were a window that Hamer and his allies watched carefully. They were not eager to storm a family home. They waited for a place where the risks to bystanders were low and the odds higher. On some nights, the pair read newspapers that carried their own names. Bonnie skimmed columns and sometimes shook her head at details that were wrong, while other lines hit too close. She wrote now and then, more quietly than before, and thought about how to set the record straight without ever stepping into a courtroom. Clyde handled the practical things: extra fuel, new plates, patches on a tire, a quick change of hair part to confuse a stranger in a lobby. He slept with one ear open and a hand near the tools of his trade. He did not relax. Not really, even when a radio played something sweet. The circle began to close because the same patterns that kept them going gave Hamer places to set his own feet. In Louisiana, he worked with Sheriff Jordan and Deputy Oakley to understand a short stretch of road near the village of Gibbsland, where tall pines leaned over the ditches and where locals knew each passing car by sound. Hamer believed that if the pair stayed tied to Methvin, then the name Methvin would lead to a place and a time. He talked to people who could reach the family and made clear that the state could be merciful where it chose to be, though no promise could undo the harm already done. Conversations like that leave marks too, on people who live their whole lives in one parish and suddenly find themselves part of a chase that inks headlines. Through all this, the ground truth stayed the same. A long list of crimes had piled up across 3 years: auto thefts, store robberies, bank jobs, kidnappings, several deaths, and assaults on peace officers that shook communities. The man at the center had come a long way from the boy with a saxophone and a borrowed car. Choices had hardened into habits, and habits into a path that shut doors faster than it opened them. By the middle of May 1934, the names Bonnie and Clyde no longer read like a curiosity in the paper. They read like a case that would only end one way. The only questions left were where, and how many more would be hurt before the last mile ran out. Morning light in those weeks felt both clean and heavy, like a promise and a warning at once. Some days they woke to birds and the smell of pine sap. And for an hour, it might have been any year. Then a truck rumbled by, or a car slowed in a way that felt wrong, and the spell broke. He would press his lips together and make a plan. She would fix her hair and fold a scrap of paper into her pocket. They would drive on, finding a path between towns that had long memories and counties that shared news over coffee. In a world full of strangers, they still had a few names and a few obligations. One of those names was Methvin. Light came early through the tall pines, the kind of morning where dew clings to weeds along a ditch, and every bird call sounds sharper than usual. A handful of men lay quiet in the waist-high grass bordering a narrow ribbon of road southeast of Gippsland, Louisiana. They had been up since dark. Coats brushed with dust, hats pulled low. They checked their positions one last time. Frank Hamer, long and steady, had spent weeks learning this stretch of blacktop and the habits of the pair he meant to stop. Beside him crouched Manny Galt, his old partner, calm as a winter pond. Nearby waited Bienville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan and his deputy Prentice Oakley, both locals who knew how sound moved through these trees. Dallas County officers Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton rounded out the group, men who understood the draw of West Dallas family ties and the sad math of risky choices multiplied over months and years. The plan relied on something simple that looked like a roadside mishap. A truck belonging to a local father sat askew with one wheel pulled. That father, Ivy Methvin, had been in quiet contact with authorities. His son Henry had run with Clyde since the prison break. The arrangement, shaped through cautious talks, aimed to separate the young man from the pair without a crossfire that might hit bystanders. Lawmen believed that if a familiar truck sat disabled, Clyde would stop. He had done favors for allies on lonely roads. He prided himself on quick help for friends and quick exits when trouble smelled close. The deputy's bet was that habit could be turned into an opening no posse had found yet. By mid-morning on the 23rd of May 1934, a tan Ford V8 appeared on the 23rd. Horizon, small as a thumbnail at first, then a plushed-over shape gliding low against the road. Hamer's jaw clenched. Hinton, who had known the pair's families for years, peered hard, trying to be sure. The car slowed, then eased toward the truck. For a heartbeat, everything held. The sheriff called out, a shout meant to be a warning. In the same instant, a trigger was pulled. Prentice Oakley's first shot tore the stillness. Then the brush exploded with reports as the trap sprang full. Dust jumped. Saplings shivered. Tires shredded. It was over fast. Faster than anyone had imagined when rehearsing in whispers. The car coasted forward, then stopped half on the shoulder. Angled as if listening, silence fell heavy, broken only by the tick of metal cooling and the quiet rush of wind through pine needles. The officers approached carefully, hearts hammering as if they had been running for miles. Years of pursuits, false leads, missed ambushes, and deaths up and down the map had brought them to this point. They had not wanted a shootout in a crowded place or near a farmhouse. This two-lane stretch offered a little privacy and no porches within easy range. What they found matched the names on the warrants pinned over desks from Texas to Oklahoma: Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. No triumphant shouts rose. The men checked for movement, then stepped back and stared down at the Ford, as if it were an animal finally stilled after a long chase. News traveled with a speed that surprised even veterans. A truck driver rolled into Gippsland and told a storekeeper, Phones jangled. By early afternoon, townspeople streamed down the road, drawn by the swirl of rumor, and the fact that for months their own nights had felt uncertain. Officers did what they could to keep a boundary between the car and the crowd. People craned necks, stood on fenders, whispered, and pointed. Some pressed too close. The scene bore all the contradictions that had haunted the story the whole way. A fascination with a notorious pair, and the sober truth that the last years had left many families grieving. Sheriff Jordan and Hamer kept folks back as best they could, urged order, and waited for the coroner. The bodies were taken to Arcadia, the parish seat, to a furniture store that also served as a funeral home, a common arrangement in small towns then. Undertakers set to their duties with care. Among those who assisted was H.D. Darby, the same young man from Ruston who had been forced into a car by the pair a year earlier and then let go with a few dollars and a shaken heart. He did his work without drama and went home with a memory nobody would ask to carry. Photographers appeared. Paper boys sold extras before supper. Headlines framed the end as a decisive victory, and from an enforcement standpoint it was. Yet even in that rush, some reporters noted the list of people who had died over the previous 2 years chasing or being chased by the same car. Families received word almost at once. In West Dallas, mothers set coffee on stoves and sat at kitchen tables under the weight of a last phone call. Bonnie's mother, Emma, who had pleaded in public for her daughter to surrender, kept her composure through a long day, and then faced the strain of a funeral next to a cloud of cameras and strangers. Clyde's parents, Henry and Cumie, stood quiet in rooms where the radio had often hummed and neighbors had left casseroles when one of their kids was sick. Grief was private, but there was no way to keep it private when a story had already traveled the length of the country multiple times. The funerals drew crowds. In Dallas, lines stretched around blocks as people came to see caskets and pay their respects, or simply satisfy curiosity born of years of sensational headlines. Bonnie had once written in a poem that she hoped to be buried by Clyde. The families did not agree. They were laid to rest in separate cemeteries in the city they had left so many nights on the run. Flowers came in abundance, some from strangers who had never met them but felt connected by the constant churn of newsprint and photographs. Ministers spoke about choices and sorrow. No sermon could balance the scales for those who had lost fathers, sons, and husbands wearing a badge, or ringing up groceries, or walking out to check a suspicious car. For the officers who had waited in the weeds that morning, the day's end brought a strange quiet. Hamer had been hired with a specific goal. He met it. He and Galt drove away without fanfare. Rewards were handled through ledgers and committees. For Sheriff Jordan's parish, the case would forever be part of local memory, told on front porches whenever a truck slowed near that bend in the road, and the late light slanted through those pines. Dallas deputies Alcorn and Hinton returned to a city where the story had begun for them, knowing that in West Dallas, folks could stand on a certain corner, point north, and recite a family tie for every house within sight. With the pair no longer on the road, the long work of courts resumed for those still living who had run with them. Raymond Hamilton was arrested later that year, after a stretch on his own with other partners. He faced trial in Texas on charges that reached back to the violent break at Eastham and other crimes. Joe Palmer, already in custody, stood before a judge for the killing of Major Joe Crowson during the prison escape. Both men were convicted and later executed in 1935. Those outcomes followed a pattern set down in law. Juries listened to testimony, weighed the deaths that had occurred, and delivered sentences under statutes written long before any of the defendants had been born. The cases underscored a point that the saga sometimes obscures. This was not an era without law. It was an era of hard choices under hard conditions, and courts kept working through the clamor. W.D. Jones, the teenager swept up at 16, had been caught months before the final year and had talked openly to officers. He received a long sentence but eventually left prison. Older, chastened, and carrying a past he would explain again and again to people who asked what it had been like to sit behind a wheel on nights that no longer felt real. Blanche Barrow, arrested in Iowa after the Dexfield Park fight, served her time in Missouri. She lived quietly after release and later wrote about the months on the road, offering details that matched case files and correcting myths where she could. Her account didn't excuse harm. It put events back into the rooms and fields where they had happened, with the heat, fear, and hunger that rushed through them. Henry Methvin, whose presence near Eastham had tied him to some of the worst days, benefited from the cooperation arranged through his family in Louisiana. Charges were handled in a way that reflected that help, though his later years did not go smoothly. The choices of youth can take a long time to unwind. Even Ivy Methvin, the father, found his name drawn into arguments about deals and duty that small communities never forget. People in Bienville Parish still told the story decades later, parsing who had done right and who had done what necessity demanded when a dangerous pair kept crossing their parish line. Public reaction after the ambush shifted sharply. During the height of bank failures and farm foreclosures, some readers had toyed with the idea that all outlaws were sticking up institutions that had hurt common people. Time and facts had punctured that notion. The list of those harmed included clerks, gas station attendants, Smalley-town law officers, and store owners whose margins were thin. Editorials in spring and summer of 1934 emphasized that point. Communities held memorials for the fallen. J.N. Boucher in Hillsborough, Deputy Eugene Moore in Stringtown, Undersheriff Doyle Johnson in Temple, Deputy Malcolm Davis in Dallas, Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman in Joplin, Troopers H.D. Murphy and E.B. Wheeler near Grapevine, and Constable Cal Campbell in Commerce. Families gathered by headstones and remembered kindnesses that never make front pages: how a son fixed a fence without being asked, how a husband read to his kids after supper, how a neighbor stayed to help after a storm. Those memories rebalanced the story. The car that had carried the pair through so many nights became an exhibit, towed from the roadside with windows clouded by dust and the marks of that last morning. It made a circuit of fairs and shows as a stark reminder that speed and daring don't keep consequences away forever. Years later, it settled in a permanent display where visitors could stand and consider a history that looked different up close than it did at a distance. Cameras, the very things that had once helped shape the pair's legend, now showed the costs. Investigators closed files one by one. They logged stolen vehicles recovered in farm lots and garages from Texas to Iowa. They sent letters to banks and shops, noting where stolen money orders or checks had turned up. They filed evidence from tourist cabins, scraps of maps, license plates, broken safes, empty holsters, the ordinary debris of a crowded life on the run. Those papers sit in archives today, a paper trail that counters the fog of myth. The records show more small business targets than big banks, more petty thefts and desperate flights than thrilling heists. They also show a steady escalation. Once violence entered the Pros Bleed, BS picture and officers had fallen, the chase could end in only a few ways. Families who had known Clyde as a boy tried to hold two pictures at once: the kid with a saxophone practicing on a porch, and the man who chose a path that put him in the crosshairs of every department for 5 states. Neighbors remembered a bright grin, a habit of helping with little chores, and also the quick temper that flared when he felt cornered or judged. People argue, even now, about how much the prison system hardened him beyond repair, and how much he chose hardness to suit what he wanted. The truth fits somewhere in the overlap. Conditions were harsh, and choices mattered. Bonnie's memory often gets crowded by false details born of rumor. Those who studied the case closely point out that the story about laughter at Grapevine was retracted by the man who first spread it. And some eyewitnesses said she never fired during certain incidents. Yet she traveled armed, joined robberies, and took part in kidnappings. She wrote poems that swung between bravado and sorrow, a mix that suggests she understood the wreckage accumulating behind them, even as she pressed forward. Her injury from the Wellington crash never fully healed, turning the last year into a grind of pain. She seldom showed outside the car. Looking back across the 3-year span, a pattern emerges. Early thefts taught the wrong lessons about risk and reward. Repeated escapes fed a belief that speed could outrun accountability. Each time someone got hurt, the fear of capture grew, and with it the willingness to meet law officers with sudden fire rather than surrender. That spiral is why Hamer, a man not prone to dramatics, insisted on an ambush outside of town where no family would step onto a porch and into a crossfire. He understood that a traffic stop on a city street could lead to another grieving house. The Great Depression's shadow, and the way it squeezed families, explains some facts without excusing them. West Dallas in the late 1920s and early 1930s was a place where kids learned to make do with almost nothing. Out of that scarcity came hard bargains and sharper temptations. Many in the same neighborhood chose steady work, church socials, and nights on stoops swapping stories under warm skies. A few, Clyde among them, reached for a faster route. That fork in the road set the stage for everything that followed. After the last headlines faded, mothers in Texas still set plates for supper. Deputies still checked silent roads, and clerks still rang up gas and bread for people heading home from mills and fields. Life kept going in the ordinary way that outlasts any spree. The names Bonnie and Clyde stayed in print as books, articles, and later films tried to retell events. Some versions lacquered the rough parts with shine. Others leaned too hard on condemnation, flattening everyone into a single note. The best histories kept to the record, naming each victim and placing every incident back in the towns where school bells rang and church choirs practiced on Wednesday nights. The last months of Clyde Barrow's life show a young man past the point of easy return, a person shaped by family love and by places that demanded grit, who then chose a line of work that harmed people who had done him no wrong. He carried anger for the prison fields that nearly broke him and repaid that anger with acts that brought grief to others. The end on that Louisiana road stopped the damage spreading forward. It did not undo the losses. What remains is a caution told softly to anyone tempted by speed and the illusion of a shortcut. There are no real shortcuts, only roads that look smooth for a mile or two, and then fall away where you cannot see. As summer of 1934 rolled on, the region exhaled. Patrolmen made their rounds without scanning every Ford V8 twice. Families took Sunday drives without glancing in the mirror as often. Those comforts returned because a long chase had ended. The case files, the funerals, the quiet houses, and the fields under big skies held the rest. That is the measure that matters more than legend. The steady lives interrupted and resumed. The badges draped and lifted. The towns that learned, again, that choices ripple outward in ways no one can fully control when the first choice sets a wheel on the wrong track. In the quiet that followed, a different kind of story took shape, one made of paperwork, courtrooms, and families trying to return to ordinary routines. Patrol cars no longer raced at every rumor. Shopkeepers slept a little better. Yet the ripple of those years kept moving. Clerks told their children why they still flinched when a fast car slowed near the curb. Deputies folded crepe from mourning ribbons and set them in drawers, then went back to checking doors on Main Street after closing time. The country was still clawing its way out of hard seasons, and people were ready to let the noise of one long chase die down. But closing a case is not the same as forgetting it. The rest of the tale lives in what came next for the people who had stood close to the fire and for the institutions that had tried to hold a line when the wind kept changing. Two men who had run from Eastham in that bold raid, Raymond Hamilton and Joe Palmer, walked into courtrooms where the air felt cool and formal compared with fields and back roads. Witnesses told juries about the January break, the guard who had fallen, and the chain of events that stretched across several states. Trials ended with convictions. In 1935, both men faced the last sentence the law allowed in Texas at that time. The state carried it out in the same deliberate way it used for all such cases, a process that moved on a schedule far different from the frantic pace of the months they had spent on the run. Their stories were not mysteries. Filings, transcripts, and appeals laid out what had happened, who had been present, and how judges weighed the evidence. The youngest, who had been drawn in W.D. Jones, paid for the choices of his 16th year with seasons behind walls. He had talked to investigators after his arrest in Houston in late 1933, giving a picture of joyrides that curdled into fear and of nights when he did not know how to step out of the whirlwind he had helped create. Time and distance gave him words for it that he didn't have when he was darting from county to county. He left prison older and kept his head down, the way people do when they have learned how quickly attention can turn to heat. Blanche, Buck's wife, who had been captured in Iowa after the fight at the abandoned fairground, served her sentence in Missouri. Her eye, injured by glass at the Red Crown Tourist Court, never fully recovered. Years later, when she finally told the story in her own voice, she returned the tale to its human scale. The cramped hideouts, the sore feet, the hard bread, the fear that settled on the chest at night. She didn't pretend it had been noble. She didn't polish it into something shiny. She described what she saw in rooms that smelled of gun oil and dust and what it felt like to watch her husband fade in a hospital far from home. Henry Methvin's path bent in another direction because of the understanding that had been worked out through his father. Prosecutors shaped charges in light of the help that made the final ambush possible. That did not turn his life into a smooth road. Trouble shadowed his later years, and he died young, far from newspaper front pages. Even the father who had let his truck be used in the plan found himself the subject of rumors. Small parishes remember their stories in detail, and people argued quietly for years about who had made the right calls and who had made do with the least harmful choice available when danger kept coming down the same road. For the lawmen, the end was not a celebration so much as the closing of a long ledger. Frank Hamer went home to a life of chores, neighbors, and occasional private work. He had spent months moving across state lines, listening more than talking, and waiting for a moment that would cause the least risk to bystanders. He chose a spot where no family would step onto a porch and find themselves in a crossfire. That kind of patience is not easy to show in the middle of fear and public pressure. His partner on that last day, Manny Galt, returned to his own routines in Texas and died a few years later. Sheriff Henderson Jordan lived on in Bienville Parish, where people knew exactly where the road narrowed near the ditch where the officers had waited. Deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton walked Dallas streets again, aware that every knock on a door carried a story behind it. Some good came from the lessons learned the hard way. Departments in several states improved how they communicated across county and state lines. Radios that crackled earlier with static carried clearer calls. Descriptions of cars, plates, and suspects moved faster. Training sharpened. In Texas, a broader reorganization of public safety followed in the mid-1930 seconds, blending hard experience into new structures. Cars got better too, which meant officers had a chance to catch up when someone decided to run. These changes didn't come out of thin air. They came from nights spent rolling down gravel in the dark, from maps spread out under dashboard lights, and from the realization that cooperation beats bravado when the job is to keep towns safe. The prison system that had left such a mark on Clyde's life felt the impact as well. The Eastham raid embarrassed officials and prompted reviews of staffing, procedures, and security. Oversight committees asked hard questions, and wardens answered them. Reforms moved slowly, as they tend to do, but the glare of public attention pushed practices toward greater accountability. Nothing could scrub away the pain of lives broken by earlier brutality or by the spiral of violence that followed. Still, the record shows officials trying to adapt, to bring a sprawling set of farms and units under stricter standards so that the law would be enforced without turning anyone into less than human. Memory, though, is a stubborn thing. Photographs left behind in Joplin did more than become front-of-page curiosities. They set a tone that sometimes buried context. One frame showed Bonnie with a cigar posed for effect. She was not a cigar smoker, according to friends and family, but the picture made its own weather, and many readers took it as gospel. The snapshot of her grinning with a pistol tucked in her skirt made for a sharp image but said nothing about long days spent in pain after the Wellington crash, or the way she bandaged her leg with strips torn from whatever cloth was at hand. Pictures are powerful, and the public often remembers what it can see faster than what it can read. Reports in those years often listed banks first, because that word draws the eye. Yet the case files contain more entries for small stores, filling stations, groceries, and lonely cash drawers than for vaults. There were bank jobs, some clumsy, some brisk, scattered from Texas into Oklahoma and Missouri. But many of the fast moves the group made focused on places where a single clerk kept watch under a humming light. They carjacked for speed, ordered drivers out, and rolled away with apologies that didn't soften the fear left in a driver's hands on the steering wheel. They often treated captives with a rough courtesy, giving $1 or $2 and saying not to run to a phone for a while. Yet the people taken never forgot the sight of a barrel or the way a sudden command can turn the morning thin, cold. The major killings attached to Clyde's name are a list that families still recite at memorials. In Hillsborough, shop owner J.N. Butcher lost his life when a robbery turned into a scramble for the door. In Stringtown, Deputy Eugene Moore fell at a country dance, with the sheriff wounded beside him. In Temple, Under-Sheriff Doyle Johnson went out to check a disturbance near his house and didn't return. In Dallas, Deputy Malcolm Davis was cut down during a watch meant to bring a fugitive in. In Joplin, Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman died, trying to question a suspicious group in a quiet neighborhood. Near Grapevine, Highway Patrolman H.D. Murphy and E.B. Wheeler were slain on a road where they had thought more about Sunday dinners than danger. In Commerce, Constable Cal Campbell lost his life, and Police Chief Percy Boyd was taken on a forced ride that he would remember in court. Those names anchor the story in real loss. If you strip away the haze of legend and look at the methods, a pattern appears. The group favored newer cars with strong engines and learned to swap plates almost as quickly as some people tie their shoes. Clyde liked Ford V8 8 seconds for simple reasons: speed when it mattered, and enough durability to handle bad roads. They usually traveled with blankets, canned food, and spare fuel. They preferred cash, knew how to pry open a small safe, and kept tools wrapped to avoid making noise when they bounced over ruts. They entered towns early, when streets were empty, or just before closing, when a clerk might be tired, and less likely to raise an alarm before the couple backed out and pointed the hood toward a county line. None of it took genius. It took nerve, a feel for routine, and a willingness to make choices others would not make. Bonnie kept writing. Her verses, light and rhymed, read like a window cracked open on a hot night. She joked about headlines, then undercut her own bravado with lines that sounded like someone humming to stay calm in a storm. The famous poem in which she sketched what an end might look like reads today with a quiet that feels heavier than the wit on the surface. She knew the road was closing. Clyde, who had loved a saxophone once, poured his hours into maps and engines. He taught himself to fix almost anything mechanical enough to be fixed with a wrench and nerve. Those small details, ink drying on paper, oil on hands, make the story more human without making it gentle. As years passed, storytellers took hold. A ballad here, a radio segment there, then books that tried to sort rumor from record. Much later, a film would lean hard on style and spark fresh debate about where art ends and responsibility begins. The movie that many people think of first brought the pair to a new generation with a rush of color and speed that kept the mood of the 60s and blurred some edges of the 30s. It captured the restless energy of young people who feel the world is stacked against them. It also drew criticism from those who remembered names on headstones. In time, other films, documentaries, and a stage musical added versions that aimed for different balances, some foregrounding the victims, some staying with the fugitive's point of view. Each retelling sits beside the old clippings that list dates and counties. Families at the center of the story carried on. Bonnie's mother lived to see her daughter's name move through cycles of attention, from scandal to nostalgia to subjects in schools where students read about the depression and the dust that pushed families off farms into shantytowns. Clyde's parents, Henry and Cumie, had a long line of children and grandchildren who knew how often neighbors asked about the boy who left home and never came back. They had seen him as a child, mending things and working when work could be found. They saw how prison ground him down. They wished, like many parents, for a different set of answers to the same old questions about anger, pride, and shortcuts that turn into long detours. The touring car that had once been a blur across rural roads became a still object, surrounded by velvet ropes. People stood in front of it, the way they stand in front of exhibits that hold a charge from another era. Guides explained where it had traveled afterward, how it had been displayed at fairs and roadside attractions, and how the ache of a real event can get wrapped in carnival lights. Visitors measured the gap between the loud tales they had heard and the quiet facts presented on a small sign nearby. Those who knew the names of victims sometimes set a hand on that sign the way someone might touch a grave marker, then stepped away with a long breath. Behind all of it sits the wider picture of a country under strain. When banks failed and farms dried out, people made bargains they would never have considered in easier seasons. West Dallas saw tents and rough shacks go up along the river bottoms. Families like the Barrows learned to stretch stew, patch clothes, and trade work for food. Many of Clyde's neighbors chose steady labor when they could find it, and endured long gaps when they could not. Church suppers, kin, and small kindnesses kept spirits above water. The same scarcity that forged resilience also sharpened the pull of fast cash. That push and pull shaped a boy already bent toward risk and quick solutions. His story does not excuse, but it does explain. Even now, historians sift letters, court records, arrest logs, and family recollections to keep the account straight. They flag places where claims were made for effect. They mark uncertainties where witnesses disagreed. They place incidents back on the streets and porches where they occurred, and into lives that did not fit a script. They remind us that headlines were typed by hands attached to people who were tired, rushed, and sometimes swayed by the need to sell papers during lean years. Out of that work comes a truer frame. A young man shaped by poverty, injury, and anger. who then made decisions that caused real harm. A young woman who followed and took part, writing jokes and laments while limping through days of constant motion. Friends who dipped in and out, some sweeping others along, some trying to slow the ride, some stepping away too late. When you picture the end of a long day in those times, don't see only the flash of a camera or the sweep of a headline. Picture a small store closing at dusk, a clerk flipping a sign to read, "Closed," a deputy checking a lock, a mother setting a plate for a husband who would be late because a report needed finishing. Picture the same mother months later at a memorial with friends on either side, nodding as kind words are said for a steady man whose name did not travel beyond a county line until the day he fell. That is where the story lands after the rush fades in rooms where people take care of one another, after harm has come close, in towns that keep going, and in the clear air of mornings when the only sound is the wind through trees that line a two-lane road. The very kind of road that carried a name out of West Dallas and across maps until the line stopped and the files were closed. After the funerals and the cleared desks, there was still more to lay out so the picture wouldn't lean on rumor. To understand what Clyde chose and why his name kept turning up in so many towns, you have to look closely at the lives that fed into those choices, the tools he trusted, the companions who cycled through the front seats of borrowed cars, and the long list of places where nights went wrong for other people trying to make an honest living. He grew up in a patch of West Dallas where the Trinity River bends and the ground turns to mud after a rain. Families scratched out shelter from boards and tar paper, built cook stoves from bricks, and hauled water in buckets. A cement plant loomed not far off. Church picnics, Saturday baseball, and front-of-porch music gave the neighborhood its better moments. Clyde learned to work early, learned to bluff when work ran out, and learned to love machines. He played a saxophone, carried it in a scuffed case, and watched car lots with hungry eyes. The world had rules. Poverty bent them every day. The boy who hated being told no became the man who told himself he could make his own path without waiting for anyone's permission. Before prison hardened him, his early offenses were small in scale but steady. Borrowing a car and not returning it, riding along on breakums where older boys took cash boxes and watches, trying to pry open a back door with borrowed tools. Police wrote his name in ledgers, sometimes let him go, sometimes kept him overnight. None of those scrapes stopped him. He moved from Dallas to nearby towns, always looking for a chance to seem taller than he felt. He linked up with a sly, nimble thief named Ralph Fultz, and with Raymond Hamilton, slicker and more restless than most. They learned which shops had flimsy locks, which rural banks had guards who went home for supper, which roads gave a clean line to the county line. The pattern set. Bonnie's road into his life came from a different direction. Born in 1,910 inches Rowena, Texas, she moved with her mother and siblings to West Dallas after her father died. She was quick in school, wrote neat lines on paper, did well in English, and acted in plays with confidence that says something about how she held herself even when homes had dirt floors and meals stretched thin. At 16, she married a boy named Roy Thornton. He ran off more often than he stayed. She wore his ring after they split, more out of habit than hope. By the time she met Clyde in 1930, she was waitressing, helping at a friend's house, scribbling poems in the evenings. She liked cameras, liked words, and liked people who could make her laugh. When Clyde walked in, the air tilted. That part was simple. The rest was not. The arrest that sent him to Eastham Prison Farm in 1930 cut a mile-wide trench through him. He entered young and came out older in ways that weren't just about birthdays. He was abused inside, fought back hard once in a moment that left a man dead, maimed himself to dodge the hardest labor, then gained parole with help from his mother's plea. He limped when he walked after that. He also stopped believing the world would ever give him a fair shake. Instead of turning away from the crowd that had pulled him under, he doubled down. That choice shaped every winter night that followed. A few details many people forget tell you how his mind worked. In March 1934, weeks before the last road, he wrote a short, respectful note to Henry Ford praising the V80 engine. He wasn't trying to be clever. He truly admired the way a strong motor could swallow miles. He studied maps, learned the location of state lines, and tracked where telephone exchanges could spread word in minutes. He handled weapons as tools, not trophies, favoring fast-firing rifles taken from guard armories by partners before they met him, and pistols he cleaned at motel sinks. He kept blankets, canned food, a bottle of mercurochrome, tape, and extra plates in the trunk. He He treated escape routes the way good mechanics treat a parts diagram, knowing each turn by feel. When people talk about the Barrow Gang, they often picture one fixed lineup. In truth, it was a shifting set of partnerships. The name at the center stayed the same. Around him moved Buck and Blanche for a stretch in 1933, the teenager W.D. Jones from late 1932 into the middle of 1933, Hamilton in and out across 2 years, Joe Palmer for the prison break and the days that followed, and Henry Methvin in 1934. Each brought certain habits, certain limits. Each departure or arrest rearranged what the group could attempt. No one built a fortune. Most jobs barely paid for gas, food, cabin rentals, and replacement cars. Clyde's crimes stacked up across state lines not because he sought size, but because constant flight pushed him forward. He robbed banks in small towns when he spotted lazy security, or a manager who kept hours as regular as sunrise. He robbed groceries, drugstores, and filling stations on roads where a single clerk worked late into the night. He stole cars from driveways and lots, sometimes telling himself he would leave them somewhere easy to find when he was done, as if that softened the blow. He kidnapped a handful of people in order to make a clean getaway, then let them go with a couple of dollars as a warning not to raise an alarm too soon. Those gestures didn't erase the fear he left behind. In houses across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and, for a brief, battered stretch, Iowa and Kansas, people learned to listen for the sound a powerful engine makes when the driver barely lifts off the throttle. That sound woke dogs and kept owners from sleeping. The hard list of deaths tied to his flight falls across those same states. During a robbery in Hillsborough in April 1932, shop owner J.N. Busher didn't survive. At a country dance near Stringtown that August, Deputy Eugene Moore died, and the sheriff was wounded. Later that winter in Temple, Under Sheriff Doyle Johnson fell as he stepped outside his home. In January 1933, Deputy Malcolm Davis died during a watch in West Dallas. In April at Joplin, Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman were killed when officers tried to question a group in a rented garage apartment. On a Sunday afternoon near Grapevine in 1934, Troopers H.D. Murphy and E.B. Wheeler were slain at the roadside. 5 days later near Commerce, Constable Cal Campbell was killed, and Police Chief Percy Boyd taken on a forced ride that ended only after many miles. Every name on that list marks a family that sets a chair at holidays and sees the space where someone should be. Newspaper pictures lurched public feeling. The set taken from the Joplin hideout showed 2 young people clowning with pistols and a cigar. Readers mistook a playful pose for a constant attitude. The truth had more grind in it. Bonnie limped through months after the 1933 crash at the bridge near Wellington. Her leg burned so badly that moving took grit. She washed wounds with water from gas station bathrooms, wrapped them tight, and tried not to slow the men she rode with. She wrote poems between stops, verses full of jokes and fatalism, drawing a future with a thin pen line that looked almost like acceptance. She was not a bystander. She knew what they were doing. The poems didn't justify the path, they revealed how she tried to carry it. The law did not stand still. Texas officials, embarrassed by East Hum's breach, asked a ranger with a reputation for patience to lead a careful hunt. He spent weeks on back roads, talked to farmers, gasmen, and cousins, and studied habits so closely that he could guess a route by the way a certain driver liked to come at a county line. He wanted an arrest away from houses. He got a stoppage on a rural road where no porch sat within easy range. Even so, he knew an ambush would be argued for years. He also knew that a traffic stop in town could leave bystanders hurt. Choices in that last chapter were made with a cold eye toward preventing that. Courts in several states kept turning even while the chase grabbed headlines. Indictments for robbery, auto theft, assault, and murder stacked up in county files from Dallas to Atoka County to Jackson County in Missouri, to the parish where the last morning came. A few banks posted detailed lists of what had been taken: rolls of coins, a bag of small bills, checks pulled from drawers, ledgers snatched by mistake. Insurance adjusters visited shops and listened to owners ashamed to say how little stood between them and closing for good. When the central pair died, many of those papers remained open until accomplices were caught. Over 1,934 and 1,935, prosecutors closed what they could. The rest became footnotes in thick binders. People who study the case still correct the record. They note that some crimes were pinned to the pair by eager reporters long before evidence existed. They mark where eyewitnesses disagreed or changed stories under pressure. They point out that Bonnie wasn't smoking a cigar as a habit, that one rumor about laughter at a crime scene came from a single man who later admitted he had overstated things, and that enthusiasm for a headline can distort memory. Yet when corrections are done, the core remains. A long robbery spree, frequent car theft, multiple kidnappings, and a string of officers and civilians who did not live to tell their part of the story. Families on both sides bore complicated truths. Clyde's parents loved their son and hated what he had done. They fed him when he risked brief visits, then watched him drive away knowing that love could not steer him back to safety. Bonnie's mother worked, prayed, and pleaded for surrender in public, trying to pull her daughter out of the current without pushing her further from shore. The families of the fallen watched those pleas with grace and pain, aware that every new day on the run might add another grave. There were small oddities. An undertaker once forced to ride in the couple's car later helped prepare their bodies, turning a circle few would believe if it were fiction. A polite note to an automaker became famous, proof of how a person can love a machine that does exactly what it promises even when the driver breaks every promise a citizen should keep. A teenager who joined for excitement ended up alone in a cell, relearning how to sleep without waking at the slightest sound. A woman who had run on bad roads with bad luck, lost an eye to shattered glass, and found life again in quiet after release, her account giving texture to places that had been reduced to quick snapshots. If you line up the towns on a map and draw the roads between them, you see loops more than straight lines. They often doubled back to Dallas for family, swung north through Oklahoma for open country, cut east toward Arkansas and Missouri for tourist cabins with garages, dipped south toward Louisiana when they needed the cover of pine forests, then fanned west to small Texas towns where a new car might sit unattended for an hour in a driveway. Those loops tell you as much about the chase as any single incident. Never enough time, always a need for gas, always a hunger for the next safe bed, never a real safety in any bed at all. The Times shaped the arc. Bank failures turned headlines sour, and made readers cheer at first for anyone who seemed to strike at institutions they blamed. Then they saw who was actually losing cash and blood: clerks, deputies, owners of small places run by families, and sympathy dried up. The federal government expanded what its agents were allowed to do. Radios grew more reliably. Patrol cars got quicker. Within a few years, other famous names on wanted posters met ends not so different from the one on the Louisiana road. That decade taught a hard lesson about speed without roots. If there is a single sentence that fits the record, it might be this: Clyde Barrow was the product of a hard-scrabble childhood and a brutal prison system, and he then used the skills he learned to harm people who did him no wrong. He could be charming, funny, helpful to neighbors, and still commit crimes that left families grieving. He loved music enough to carry a sax, loved engines, and loved the idea of outrunning shame, which no one outruns for long. He was not a Robin Hood. The ledgers of stores and the headstones of officers are the measure that matters. Those ledgers and those stones sit in courthouses and cemeteries today, solid in a way that headlines never are. Stories about him persist because they sit at the crossroads of grit, love, fear, and speed. The poems Bonnie left behind add a human voice that complicates a simple verdict without overturning it. The photographs remind us how a split second can set a tone for years. The car in a display case shows how fast a life can go when a driver takes every turn without stopping to think about where the road ends. Children in Texas still learn the names in schools when classes study the Depression. They read dates, see pictures, and hear teachers repeat the advice that should have led the young man away from the path he took. Hard times do not excuse hurting people. Wanting more does not make taking right. The fastest road is often the shortest only to the cliff. As nights quieted in the mid-Withirties, parents told their kids to be home by dark, deputies eased off the gas a little, and store owners kept cash drawers light. Time spread a blanket over the noisy parts. The rest remains in files and in memories held by families who visit graves on cool mornings, touch names carved in stone, and tell stories that keep ordinary kindness alive alongside hard facts. In those voices, the complicated life of Clyde Barrow finds its lasting place, not as a legend to copy, but as a caution to hear. In the years after the sirens went quiet, the story kept traveling in softer ways told over coffee at kitchen tables, in classrooms where the depression gets a chapter, and in small museums where a photograph sits under glass with a caption that shortens long months into 2 lines. What lasts in those tellings isn't the rush of engines. It's the ordinary bits that make the picture clearer. People remember a boy who carried a saxophone because music made the evening feel bigger than the lot where he stood. They remember a girl who wrote rhymes on scraps because words helped her move through days that were heavier than her size. They remember parents who set out extra plates because that is what parents do even when their own cupboards are thin. From those rooms and porches came someone who decided to outrun shame by taking what was not his, and someone who went with him, saying yes in moments when no would have been safer for everybody. The neighborhoods that raised them were built on favors traded, tools borrowed, and the habit of showing up when a neighbor needed a hand. That closeness cuts both ways. It kept families afloat during years when paychecks vanished. It also made it easier for a young man to find a lookout, a spare set of plates, or a garage to hide in for a night. When people later listed the towns touched by his choices, they drew lines across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and up toward Iowa and Kansas. The map looks wide, yet most stops were small and repetitive. A late open store, a pump island with one clerk, a rural bank where the vault wasn't enormous and the staff knew every regular by name. He preferred quick moves to long sieges. If a watcher spotted a uniform, the plan changed to retreat in seconds. It wasn't clever so much as practiced. Many episodes never made front pages beyond a county. Registers got emptied, safes pried, cars taken and dumped. Sometimes a manager found a door splintered and coins scattered on the floor like dull rain. Sometimes an owner arrived just after dawn and counted the missing bills with a knot in his stomach because that small stack had been meant for wages or a delivery. A few times, the plan snagged. A time lock refused to open. A clerk stalled just long enough to reach a hidden alarm. A customer's unexpected entrance sent the group out the back door and into an alley with nothing to show for the risk, but more heat in the rearview mirror. Those stumbles didn't stop them. They merely made the next choice sharper. He learned from older thieves how to read a street, where the light fell at midnight, which night watchman walked his beat 5 minutes before the hour, which train whistle meant a crossing would block a pursuing car. He loved machines because they obeyed. A tuned motor didn't judge. It did what it was supposed to do every time if the driver respected its limits. That devotion led to constant tinkering new plugs, adjusted points, a clean carburetor. He kept a spare fan belt in the trunk under blankets and tins, and he checked the radiator cap as carefully as he checked ammunition because a burst hose could strand him worse than any flat tire. The press, hungry during lean years, built the pair into a headline that could move papers on slow afternoons. Reporters wrote in a hurry, blending fact, rumor, and local flavor from stringers who had only a few minutes to talk with deputies before deadlines. That rush explains why some claims grew large. A line about a laughing woman at a roadside scene spread faster than the later correction from a witness who said he had been mistaken. A pose with a cigar turned into a trait. Over time, careful researchers matched court records to dates and pruned what didn't hold up. Even after the pruning, the trunk that remained was solid. A sequence of robberies, kidnappings to secure escapes, car thefts again and again, and a list of people who did not make it home because a speeding car and a sudden decision met them at a bad moment. Families of the fallen folded the story into rituals that were quieter than the papers. They took flowers to stones with carefully carved names. J.N. Boucher in Texas, whose shop never felt the same to his neighbors after that April. Deputy Eugene Moore in Oklahoma, killed at a dance that had started as a simple night of music under strings of lights. Undersheriff Doyle Johnson in Temple, who stepped onto his porch on a holiday and didn't come back. Deputy Malcolm Davis in Dallas, who believed he might bring a young fugitive in without more loss. Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman at Joplin, caught by a storm of fire in a rented garage. Highway Patrolman H.D. Murphy and E.B. Wheeler near Grapevine, 2 young men who thought more about Sunday plans than danger moments before they were confronted. And Constable Cal Campbell in Commerce, with Police Chief Percy Boyd, taken on an ordeal that would echo in a courtroom later. Each family learned how a date can turn from a day in a calendar into a marker that rearranges every month after. The law adapted, not because of one case alone, but because that case fit into a larger shift. Cars had changed distance. Radios shrank the time between a cry for help and a reply. New laws expanded what federal agents could pursue when crimes crossed state lines, especially in stolen vehicles. Rangers, sheriffs, and highway patrols learned to share information in ways that had felt optional a few years earlier. Workshops sprung up where officers traded tips about reading tire tracks, calling in plate numbers, and approaching a suspicious car without putting bystanders at risk. Those practical changes outlasted the headlines. They made it harder for later crews to live by the same habits that had carried this one across so many county lines. One reason the pair's image endures is the way two contrasting pictures sit side by side. On one side is the boy from West Dallas, who wrote polite letters and loved music, who was helpful to neighbors and funny when he felt safe. On the other is the man who pointed guns at clerks, shook motorists with sudden orders, and refused to give himself up even when he must have known that the road ahead held only one end. On one side is the waitress with a quick smile who entered writing contests in school and memorized lines for class plays. On the other is the woman who traveled armed, kept watch at windows, and practiced with pistols she cleaned at bathroom sinks in tiny cabins. Holding those pictures together is uncomfortable. It should be. People can be kind in one room and cruel in another. What counts is the harm left behind when the doors close. Some details that surface in family memories are small but telling. Neighbors said he fixed radios for older folks without asking for pay. A tangle of wires and tubes turned neat by patient hands. Family said he took turns washing pots and loading firewood when a kitchen was busy, even when he was jumpy from lack of sleep. Friends remembered that he hated to see a child scared of loud voices. He went quiet then, as if ashamed. Those glimpses do not cancel the public record. They show why relatives grieved not only the way the life ended, but the way earlier promises were traded for speed. Bonnie's mother held on to school essays with perfect penmanship and recipes her daughter copied out for fun. She also kept clippings that hurt to reread because they told what her daughter had done. That mix is hard to carry. Many mothers have had to carry something like it in other eras, and they all walk a little slower afterward. The prisons that shaped him changed over time, not fast, but enough that people studying the files can see the curve shift. Oversight pressed for better staffing, clearer rules, and humane treatment. Nothing miraculous happened. Work still defined the days. Heat still pressed down in summer on fields that stretched to the horizon. Yet the institutions learned that brutality doesn't fix behavior. It twists it. If the Eastham break and the months that followed taught anything, it was that crushing a young man does not always produce obedience. It can produce a burst of anger that spills past fences and onto roads where strangers pay for it. That's a lesson wardens and lawmakers return to whenever budgets and headlines tempt them toward rough shortcuts. Artifacts from the chase took on lives of their own. The car that once slid around corners became a stared-at object at fairs and shows, then settled into a permanent spot where visitors pause and measure the difference between a photograph and the metal in front of them. Cameras that had once turned the pair into a symbol now turn visitors into viewers who step closer, then step back, moved by something they can't quite name. A typewriter used to peck out verses rests under a light in another case, the ribbon long since dry, the keys fixed in place, yet the idea of hands making something with words still alive in the air around it. Ordinary things hold the strongest charge because they anchor large stories to small realities. He died at 25. She died at 23. Youth can feel older than it is when days are packed with miles and fear, but numbers on a stone don't lie. Those numbers sharpen the sadness of the early chapters. Children in rough houses figuring out how to help, a teenager learning a sax line on a porch, a girl writing with a neat hand that made teachers smile. The short span also explains why the story got wrapped in romance for later audiences, hungry for tales about beautiful rebels. Real families who kept records pushed back. They didn't want a gloss that made clerks and deputies into simple obstacles. They wanted people to see the houses where those clerks and deputies had lived and the space that opened when they were gone. Beneath the well-known robberies, there were patterns that show both calculation and carelessness. The group watched calendars, hitting small banks near the middle of the month when payrolls might be fresh and managers tired. They preferred towns where roads in and out were simple, where a single left turn put a county line behind them. Yet they also lingered too long in familiar places, took meals in diners where accents carried across a room, and returned to Dallas for family ties that warmed the heart and chilled the blood of any officer who knew how those visits tended to end. That tug between home and survival pulled them in circles that made them easier to study and, eventually, to stop. The last letters they wrote read like people who could sense the clock. She joked in rhyme about newspapers getting details wrong and about a future she sketched brave and bleak in the same line. He wrote to the automaker he admired about the machine he favored, a polite note from someone who had forgotten how to ask anything of a human face. He wrote to his mother and promised what a son promises when he wants to ease a parent's mind, promises that could not be kept because the calendar had run out of blank squares. In rooms where those notes are preserved, the paper looks ordinary. That plainness makes the words feel heavier. In Dallas, the graves stand in separate cemeteries because families chose to honor their own and to set a boundary that the world would recognize. She had once imagined being buried beside him. Her mother said no, deciding that the last word belonged to the people who had raised her and who had asked in public for a peaceful surrender. That never came. Years later, her remains were moved to a different cemetery in the city, and people still visit both stones, leaving flowers, coins, or scraps of verse. The visits have a quiet tone. Most who stop know the story in outline and want to measure myth against stone. The silence around those markers is part of how communities teach younger people to feel the weight of choices made long before they were born. Other figures who crossed paths with the pair faced their own endings. Hamilton, intense and restless, went to trial and then to an end set by the law. Palmer, bound by the worst moment of the prison break, followed the same path. Methvin lived with the mixed result of a deal that separated him from the pair. His later years were troubled, his name still a point of debate in a parish where everyone has a cousin who heard a piece of the story firsthand. W.D., the kid eager to seem older, grew into a man who talked softly about how quick thrills turn into long shadows. Blanche tried to live a straight, small life after her sentence, a life where the loudest thing on most days was wind at the window and the clatter of dishes in a sink. Their accounts help fix dates and correct inflated tales. They also remind us that many who ride in cars during wild seasons have to learn later how to sit still without listening for a knock. When people ask what to learn from all of this, the best answers feel plain. Hard times can tempt anyone to reach for shortcuts. Some shortcuts look smart because they work once or twice. The third time, the cost shows. Pride keeps people from turning back after the first lucky escape. Fear adds to pride and turns the wheel faster. Love makes everything harder, because love asks us to stand beside someone even when we should step away. The only way through those tugs is to let better habits and better friends set the pace. That counsel sounds like something a grandparent would say on a porch at dusk. It is also the line that divides a life people remember with warmth from a life people read about in files with dates and labels and stamped pages. Even now, on warm nights when windows are open in North Texas, the sound of a distant motor can make an old story stir. Someone might mention a name, then add that the true measure of a person is not how fast they drove, but how they treated clerks behind counters and officers making rounds. People nod. They tell a boy carrying a horn to keep practicing. They tell a girl with a notebook to keep writing. They say that fixing a neighbor's radio matters, and that the pride that comes from honest work is the kind that never needs to run. Then they set another chair on the porch and let the air cool. The past sits with them, close but not in charge, teaching what it can without demanding attention. The last layer of a true story lives in what communities keep after the noise fades. People turn down radios, close newspapers, and go back to slow routines. Then, at supper or on a porch, someone brings up a name, and the room grows quiet for a moment while the real facts settle in. That is how this life sits now, not as a roar, but as a steady recollection shaped by records, trials, and the memories of families who lost someone during a hard run that spanned just a few years, but left a long shadow. The record shows a boy born in Ellis County who grew up near the Trinity Bottoms of West Dallas, a young man who learned cars, music, and patience with tools. It shows early thefts that taught bad lessons about risk and reward. It shows a prison term that bent his temper toward hard choices, followed by 2 years on the road in which he stole cars, robbed small banks and stores, pried open safes, snatched cash drawers, and kidnapped motorists and officials to secure quick escapes. It shows a January morning raid at a prison farm that freed inmates and left a guard mortally wounded. It shows nights and afternoons when shots were fired and people did not make it home. Shopkeepers, county deputies, city detectives, state patrolmen. Every entry sits in a ledger somewhere with dates and names that can be checked. Those names matter. In Hillsborough, shop owner J.N. Boucher was killed during a robbery. Near Stringtown, Oklahoma, Deputy Eugene Moore died at a country dance. The sheriff, C.G. Maxwell, was wounded. In Temple, Under Sheriff Doyle Johnson fell outside his home. In Dallas, Deputy Malcolm Davis was shot during a watch for a fugitive. At Joplin, Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman were slain when officers tried to question a suspicious group holed up in a garage apartment. Near Grapevine, on a Sunday, troopers H.D. Murphy and E.B. Wheeler were gunned down on a roadside. In Commerce, Oklahoma, Constable Cal Campbell was killed, and Police Chief Percy Boyd kidnapped and later released. In the Eastham raid, Major Joe Crowson succumbed to his wound. Those are the anchors that keep the tale from drifting into myth. Families still speak those names with care. Accounts at the time sometimes stretched or blurred details. Newspapers pushed rumors that were later retracted, like a claim about laughter that a witness walked back. A playful photograph with a cigar turned into an image people took too literally. Careful work since then has pared away what doesn't stand up, leaving a tighter, clearer picture. Many robberies of small places, several bank jobs, repeated auto thefts, abductions used to clear escapes, and a string of killings during flight or confrontation. Not every crime pinned on the pair was theirs, and not every detail told was fair, but the core remains heavy. The damage is not a legend. It is a list of households that set extra plates and then never needed them again. What followed the end on that Louisiana road unfolded in offices as much as on streets. Courts finished what they could. Raymond Hamilton and Joe Palmer, both tied to the prison break and other offenses, were tried and faced the ultimate penalty the next year. W. D. Jones, the teenager caught in 1933 after a run that shook him, served a long stretch before leaving prison older and quieter. Blanche Barrow, captured at the end of a desperate fight in Iowa, went to a Missouri prison, came home after serving her term, and lived in a careful way that made room for peace. Years later, her account helped set the record straight about rooms, meals, and the constant fear that never shows up in staged photographs. Henry Methvin pulled into the chase after Eastham and separated from the pair through an arrangement that helped officers, found later life rocky. He died young in an accident that closed the circle without headlines. His father, who had set his truck across a road as part of a plan to end the spree away from porches and storefronts, also died in an accident, and his name was still spoken in his parish for years whenever people argued about choices made under pressure. Law enforcement shifted in response to more than one case, but this one fit a pattern that pushed change forward. Radios improved. Patrol cars got faster. Sheriffs, rangers, and town officers built habits of sharing notes across lines that once divided them. The state reorganized parts of its public safety work, folded highway patrol duties into broader structures, and firmed up training on traffic stops and rural approaches so bystanders wouldn't be pulled into danger. On the national level, new laws and new authority gave federal agents a clearer role in crimes that crossed state lines, especially when stolen cars were involved. Those changes were not about glory. They were about making sure a clerk in a small town could lock up at night and walk home without scanning the road twice. Communities kept their own lessons. The West Dallas settlement, where one family had slept under a wagon before they could build a shack, saw the benefits of neighbors helping neighbors, church drives, and public projects that brought roads, schools, and better housing. People understood that scarcity can breed solidarity, but it can also sharpen a pull toward shortcuts. Parents said out loud to their kids what they had always believed. Hard times don't make wrong things right, and pride needs steering. They told their sons to take the long way, if the short way asked them to hurt someone who had never lifted a hand against them. They told their daughters to trust their sense when a friend's joke started to sound like plans that would break a mother's heart. Artifacts made the story feel real to later generations. The touring car, once tuned to outrun trouble, stood still under lights, while visitors read small signs that named towns and dates. People stared, then thought of the road where it stopped moving. Cameras that had helped raise a legend now helped pin it to reality. A typewriter carried the marks of a girl who wrote poems in one, a line about how the end might come that now reads like someone trying to say the truth gently to herself. Neat loops of ink on old paper do not excuse anything, but they do remind people that this history belongs to human beings, not to silhouettes. Those who want a clean lesson often lean too hard in one direction. Some paint the pair as folk figures because of the era's ruined banks and foreclosed farms. That reading ignores clerks, drivers, grocers, and officers who bore the cost. Others flatten the story into pure scorn and miss the roots that grew in ground scorched by poverty and rough custody. The better path holds both: a childhood that explains much, and a set of adult decisions that still brought grief to many doors. He came back to family again and again, but he would not come back to the law. She wrote in rhyme, and held on to love, even as fear deepened. Together they kept moving until people met them on a two-lane with a plan that reduced the risk to others. That is where the line stopped. Across the years, storytellers have retold the case in different ways. A film decades later wrapped the tale in style that fit its own time, leaning on youth and rebellion, and making many viewers forget clerks' names and officers' families. Another film, years after that, told the same arc from the side of officers who had kept watch in ditches and waited for a day when they could stop a car without bringing harm to someone on a porch. Documentaries and books went deeper, checking files, interviewing relatives, and piecing together a timeline that helps classrooms anchor dates to causes and outcomes. A stage show folded in music and made the story sound like a river of feeling running under hard facts. All of these sit beside the original papers, indictments, arrest logs, letters where the life gets its clearest outline. Facts that keep their weight include small, human notes. He wrote to the automaker whose engines he admired and said thank you in polite lines. He kept tools neat and maps worn at the edges. He changed the part in his hair and sat with family for a meal even when deputies were probably out on a road waiting. She held a blanket out to a captive who was cold, then helped plan the next turn. She kept her school ring on a chain and wore a tired smile into rooms where the radio hummed low. Those glimpses explain the pull that later audiences feel without bending judgment. People make bad choices. People also keep kindness close. Those truths sit beside each other more often than we like to admit. Because of the weight of the deaths, people asked for a number that could sum the harm. It never feels right to reduce lives to a tally. Still, historians often say roughly a dozen people died directly in cases connected to the run, most of them officers, some civilians. The exact figure depends on how strictly you define involvement, and which cases you include when eyewitness accounts conflict. Numbers offer a quick answer. Names give the story its heart. When communities hold ceremonies, they say the names, not the total. They set flowers. They speak about fathers who fixed fences without being asked, husbands who read to kids, sons who checked on older neighbors. No summary can stand in for that. A few myths are worth setting straight one more time. The pair did not build a fortune. They lived day to day, often sleeping in cars and cheap cabins, paying cash, and eating simple food. Banks were part of their list, but not the whole of it. More often they hit small businesses and gas stations where the loss of a till hurt more than headlines admit. She was photographed with a cigar as a joke during a cramped afternoon at a hideout. Friends said she didn't make a habit of smoking them. Rumors about her behavior at a roadside scene were traced back to a single voice that later recanted. She was not innocent. She was also not the cartoon some papers drew. He loved speed, but cars could not outrun the kind of responsibility that comes when people are hurt. He respected engines because they kept their promises. He forgot that people remember broken promises longer than they remember fast exits. The places they touched carried on. Oklahoma towns that had seen dances cut short kept hosting them, stringing lights on summer nights and playing fiddles all the same. Dallas grew up around the neighborhoods where they had once walked, with new roads and broader bridges crossing the Trinity. People who live near the old spots today drive past without a second thought most days, then sometimes slow and point for a visitor who asks where a certain picture was taken or where a certain road narrows between pines. That is how history lives at ground level, not as a monument but as a detail folded into someone's directions. The two stones in Dallas still draw visitors. His rests at Western Heights. Hers was moved years after to Crown Hill. Flowers and coins appear, along with notes in tidy school handwriting from students who just learned the outline and want to say something to a name that filled a chapter. Families keep those places tended. They would prefer that people who visit think of the victims first. Many do. Some read all the way through a panel at a small museum, the one that lists the officers and civilians who died. and leave with a better understanding than they had when they walked in. In the end, the story returns to a simple truth that older neighbors tell gently to younger ones. Talent for machines, quick wit, and loyalty to family are good gifts. They need steady work, patience, and humility alongside them, or they can run wild. A boy with a saxophone can grow into a man who fixes radios for older folks and stays for coffee, or he can climb into a fast car and tell himself that speed will wipe a slate clean. A girl with a notebook can build a life around warm kitchens and laughter, or she can tie her days to someone who keeps choosing the quickest exit. Love is real. Consequences are real. The best lives find a way to honor both truths, stepping off roads that look smooth but drop away just out of sight. So the story rests where it should on paper, in archives, in careful books, in small rooms where people keep memories alive for the next generation. The music a sax once made fades in the air. The car sits still under glass, the poems lie quiet in folders, and the names of the dead remain carved in stone that the weather cannot erase. People leave those places and go home. They lock up shops, check on neighbors, call kids in from yards, and sit down to supper. Somewhere, a radio plays an old song. In that ordinary hum, the lesson holds. Lives are large or small depending on the care we take with one another, and the fastest way to feel big is often the surest way to make the world smaller for everyone around us. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Clyde Barrow here, thanking you for riding along through the shadows of history. If this tale helped you drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, may the silence of the empire guide your rest, and may the whispers of the underworld carry you gently into sleep. Good night.